Dear Mr. Purvis, as I read in the papers, you mean business with the gangsters. I have a good job for you, for a man worse than Dillinger. This man real name is De Lucia, wanted in Naples, Italy for murder. His aliases are Paul Viela, Paul Salvi, Paul Ricca and he is a Capone gangster. You will find this man in the Italian villaggiati the World Fair, because the village is owned by them. I am an Italian baker. This man control the Italian baker's ass. We have to pay half cent for every pound of bread we make, and if we do not do what they say, they burn our trucks and all kinds of damages. I wish you will take care of this criminal and send him back to Italy. Hope to hear soon some good news. Very truly yours, a poor baker.
The legends of America's mobs are woven into the fabric of society and pop culture. We've all seen the movies or heard the tales of these criminal organizations. Their stories of power, wealth, respect, family, greed, betrayal, violence, murder, and mayhem. While the golden age of the mobs may be over, organized crime continues to thrive, and the stories remain as infamous as ever. You're listening to the Gangland History Podcast, hosted by mob historian Jacob Stoops. He tells the true crime biographies of real-life mobsters and dives deep into the plots, subplots, and real facts behind organized crime in America. Viewer discretion is advised.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode of the Gangland History Podcast. I am your host, Jacob Stoops, mafia historian and podcaster. We have another great show today, and I'm really excited as we're getting back into the realm of traditional biographies, which I always enjoy. Not only that, we're venturing into Chicago for the first time in this podcast. I promise I wasn't avoiding it on purpose. I just had not gotten there quite yet, and I've been sort of meandering along, and for whatever reason, we have just missed Chicago. But today, we're going to get there in a big way as we cover the man known to the underworld as Paul the Waiter Ricca. Paul the Waiter has a history that spans from the Capone era all the way into what many would consider to be the golden age of the Chicago outfit in the 1960s and 1970s. Here is a quick FBI note that sums up who Ricca really was in the grand scheme of things. Quote, ID files show that he was the top echelon crime syndicate figure who was closely associated with Anthony Accardo, operating as the co-chairman of the entire Chicago area crime syndicate. He was considered one of the most powerful hoodlums in the country. End quote. Now, if you have ever thought, and this is admittedly a weird thought, who should be on the Mount Rushmore of gangsters, I'm going to imagine that you might have put names like Capone, Gotti, Luciano, Genovese, Gambino, and Accardo, but I'm here to say that if you put Capone and Accardo on that list, then our subject today is either close behind or is interchangeable with either of those guys in terms of the level of respect that he had across the country during his particular era. In fact, if Tony Accardo were 1A, Paul Ricca would be 1B, or maybe even 1A himself, as you're about to find out. Now, I'm planning on this being a two-part series on Ricca, and I think as with most of my episodes, you're going to learn some things that you hadn't heard before regarding our subject, Ricca. I believe I've found some fairly juicy tidbits, as I always do. Now, really quickly, before we get into the show, I just wanted to say thank you to all of my Capo level Patreon members for their support. It's a small but growing family, so to speak. And welcome to my new Capos, Ducey 000 And George Takasik, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, George Takasik Jr., welcome to the family as Capos. Your support is much appreciated. I'd also like to say thank you to the people who've signed up for free over on Patreon as well. And if you're not already a member, free or paid, please head over and check it out. Also, if you have subscribed on YouTube or Spotify, thank you. If you haven't subscribed, please hit the subscribe button and turn on the bell to get notifications. I don't post as regularly as some other channels, but I can promise that when you do get episodes, it's at most points in time, almost movie-length documentaries, and I promise you won't be disappointed, especially with the amount of detail and digging that I do. All right, that's enough of my preambles. I know some people don't like them, so we're just going to get right into it. On to the episode, Paul the Waiter Ricca, Part 1. The man who would come to be known as Paul the Waiter Ricca was born Felice De Lucia. Wikipedia will say he was born on November 17, 1897 in Naples, the capital of Campagna, which is within view of the legendary Mount Vesuvius. However, I'm just going to say this, there is some debate in the documentation I found that would tend to indicate that the information in Wikipedia is incorrect. FBI records from 1966 would suggest Felice De Lucia was born on July 10, 1898 at Apricena, Italy, which is in the province of Foggia, just a few kilometers inland from the Adriatic Sea in the Puglia region of Italy. Other FBI records would suggest his actual birth date was January 14th, 1898, which ties back to a 1927 application for a savings account at the First National Bank of Chicago, Illinois. Newspapers would also say November 14th, 1898, so this is where I think the confusion is coming from, and the true facts at this point are likely lost to time. Sources would suggest De Lucia was born to parents Antonio and Annunziata De Lucia, with one paper citing the names Antonio and Maria De Lucia. But like his birth date, this information is also subject to some debate. There's a lot of debate around De Lucia, Paul Ricca. There's a lot of debate around the details of his early life. You see, in his petition for citizenship, his mother's name was actually listed as Nunzio Maria Torelli. Now, in other records, there was at least one FBI report that would cite through De Lucia's marriage records from 1927 that he was born to parents Anthony and Mary De Lucia and baptized in Naples. Now, other records would in fact notate De Lucia's father as Antonio De Lucia, while even other records would suggest that his father was a wine merchant in Italy named Enrico De Lucia. So again, more confusion amongst the various sources. De Lucia would state in April of 1944, when he was entering prison, that his father died of heart trouble in 1924 at age 54, while his mother died of blood poisoning in 1917 at age 39. He would suggest that he was the oldest of two living children of his parents, who'd also had two twins that had died at birth. Now, all of this information continues to add to the mystery of our subject's early life, as you're about to see. There was so much conflicting information that it was honestly really, really difficult to get to the actual truth of things. In any event, several FBI records in the 1960s would suggest that Felice De Lucia completed 3 years of high school in Italy and left school in 1917 after completing the 4th grade of high school in order to enlist in the Italian army. This is, of course, during the tail end of World War I. Allegedly, he served 3 years and would receive an honorable discharge in 1920. However, this information is going to be very hard to reconcile with what I'm about to tell you. You see, De Lucia by this time was living a double life and beginning to get involved in organized crime. And around this time, his family would become embroiled in a blood feud with another local family. It would be at the age of 17 or 18 that our subject would become involved in an incident that would change the course of his life and that would follow him almost to the end of his life. This incident would involve another young man named Emilio Perillo. Perillo had been engaged to Felice De Lucia's sister, but had decided for some reason to break off the engagement, which in most cultures, especially at this time, was a major sign of disrespect, but even more so in Italian and Sicilian culture, where even the slightest insult, especially Sicilian, can lead to a deadly vendetta. This was a major issue. Now, it's hard to say if this was the issue that caused the blood feud between the families, or if the blood feud between the families led to Perillo breaking off the engagement. That's lost to history. However, outraged at the affront to his family's honor and as the oldest son, this action could not pass. Retribution was almost the family's right based on the customs and norms of the culture at that time. In short order, Felice De Lucia quickly went to his contacts in the local underworld and indeed received permission to kill young Emilio Perillo. In 1915, at the tender age of just 17, he'd get the job done by stabbing Perillo to death in the town of Ottaviano near Naples. However, testimony in the 1950s from a woman named Margherita Terabile of Brooklyn, New York, who was in fact the sister of Emilio Perillo, would back up this account, but would suggest that De Lucia had shot and not stabbed her brother to death when he was just 15 years old. Unfortunately for De Lucia, he'd be arrested by the Italian authorities shortly thereafter. During his trial, a man named Vincenzo Capasso would testify against him, and this testimony would result in De Lucia being convicted for murder on May 18, 1917, and sentenced to actually just 3 years in prison. Now, of course, the question is, why was someone convicted of murder only sentenced to such a short term, you might ask? Apparently, when the court found out that there was what was deemed a grave provocation, the sentence was reduced. So this is a different time and place for sure, where murder for a grave provocation is justified legally. According to Miss Margherita Terabile, the feud between the families would take the lives of 14 persons in total. As further evidence of the ongoing feud, it's alleged by Miss Terabile that our subject's father, Antonio, and sister Amelia, along with 4 others, were convicted in Italy in 1924 for complicity in the robbery and extortion slaying of her only other brother, Raphael Perillo. According to her deposition, the sister provided the murder weapon, for which she received a 4-year sentence, while the father received 2 years, 9 months, and 10 days in prison. Although I'm sure this type of vendetta-style series of killings is something that someone would never forget, Mrs. Terabile, who came to the United States in 1922 and was living in New York in the 1950s and called to testify against our subject, suddenly remembered that this is how she recognized who Felice De Lucia truly was. And this is many, many years after. And there's no way you forget this, especially when it's probably what led you to flee the country. It's not that you suddenly remembered, it's that she was probably forced to remember. And soon after she was called to testify, as you can imagine, she would relate that she was visited by a stranger, and when federal agents next saw her, she and her husband were indeed very frightened. So as you can see, there is an air of mystery and some confusion, again, about the records and details of his early life, but most records will indicate that he was in fact a convicted murderer. This part is definitely not in doubt. There can also be really no doubt regarding the influence of the local mafia, which likely worked the system to gain a lighter sentence for the young man as well as his family members. In any event, in 1919, Felice De Lucia would get out of prison and he would have revenge on his mind. Why the need for revenge? Well, besides testifying against De Lucia, the man I just referenced a little bit ago, Vincenzo Capasso, was a suspect in an attempted shooting of De Lucia's father while the son was in prison. Though Capasso was cleared of any wrongdoing, the implication was that he had tried to kill the father. After his release, De Lucia would track down the man who testified against him and also tried to kill his father, Vincenzo Capasso. Reports would indicate that De Lucia walked into Capasso's shop and killed him on the spot. Now, legend would suggest that De Lucia would actually slit his throat, thus getting his retribution, avenging his family, and solidifying what was becoming a very murderous reputation. After the murder, his second, before the age of 21, he'd flee Italy as a fugitive and would head to the United States, though he'd be convicted in absentia of this murder and sentenced to 21 years. Records show that De Lucia would arrive in New York City on August 10th, 1920, aboard the SS Rindam, hopefully I'm pronouncing that right, which had set sail from Boulogne, France on August 1st, 1920. He was using a stolen passport under the alias of Paul Maglio. This would come back to haunt him, like a few other things, later in life. Despite arriving with a different name, he didn't arrive without a plan. You see, while in transit to America, it's alleged that the ship made a stop in Cuba. During that stop, De Lucia made a connection with a man named Giuseppe Esposito, better known as Diamond Joe Esposito. Joseph Diamond Joe Esposito also hailed from the Campagna region of Italy, and thus the two men had that in common, as well as a propensity for living on the wrong side of the law. Diamond Joe himself, born in 1871, was involved in organized crime in Chicago and was known as everything from a politician to a restaurant owner, but made his real money from bootlegging, extortion, prostitution, and labor racketeering. It's alleged that Diamond Joe was one of the primary backers of what became the 42 Gang in Chicago, which became somewhat of a farm team for the Chicago outfit with the likes of Sam Giancana, Sam Teets Battaglia, Felix Milwaukee Phil Aldericio, Mad Sam DiStefano, and Charles Chucky Nicoletti, just to name the few among the ranks of the 42 Gang. Pretty infamous gang of young thugs at the time, terrorizing Chicago. So upon arriving in New York in the early 1920s, De Lucia would meet another juggernaut, one Johnny the Fox Torrio, the head of the rackets in Chicago. Informants would later say the following, quote, "About this time, Paul the Waiter Ricca was coming into power. Ricca had been brought to Chicago during the Capone Era by Johnny Torrio. Torrio met Ricca in New York and recognized his potential as a leader and enforcer." End quote. After these two important connections were made, young Felice De Lucia made the decision to go to Chicago with the backing of Torrio and Diamond Joe, where he began working in the outfit's bootlegging operation to smuggle whiskey from various places across the country into Chicago. And that wouldn't be his only job. De Lucia would arrive in Chicago in September of 1920, residing initially at 4920 West Monroe Street prior to taking up residence later on at 812 North Lathrop Avenue in River Forest, Illinois, and eventually moving to 1515 Bonnie Bray in the 1950s. Diamond Joe Esposito's star was also rising in Chicago in the early 1920s, making this a very significant connection for De Lucia. Esposito, who earned his nickname Diamond Joe due to his propensity for wearing diamond cufflinks, rings, and other jewelry, had started to gain political clout, recently becoming a Republican ward boss of the 19th Ward in Chicago. And as anybody that's familiar with the outfit knows, the political connections were the key to running the underworld in the city. Diamond Joe would also become one of the earliest Italian Americans to become alderman, which in Chicago, again, as I just said, was absolutely a critical position over the years. This allowed Diamond Joe to be in prime position to do favors and provide political cover for the many bootlegging gangs in the area, including that of Johnny Torrio and Al Capone, as well as rivals like the Jenna brothers. At this time, De Lucia was quickly showing his abilities and potential, which impressed Esposito enough to appoint him as the maitre d' or manager. Some reports would say he was a manager at Esposito's Chicago restaurant, the Bella Napoli on 905 South Halsted Street, as well as a restaurant called Coscione's Restaurant. It is this means of employment that allegedly earned him his nickname, the Waiter. Now, this may not seem like a promotion, but when you consider that Bella Napoli was extremely popular with many of Chicago's underworld figures, this appointment became very important for De Lucia as it allowed him to make connections with wise guys in Chicago, specifically in the Chicago underworld. It's alleged that this is where De Lucia first met Frank Nitti, who was in turn responsible for introducing him to Al Capone. Nitti is alleged to have been attracted to Ricca because of his intelligence and induced him to work at the Lexington Hotel, at first as a confidential aide to Nitti. Initially, his relative anonymity was considered an asset in the activities of the gang. De Lucia would also later claim that between 1920 and 1924, he worked for the Dante Theater at 813 West Taylor Street, Chicago, as an assistant manager, earning $35 per week. And from 1924 to 1930, he owned 2 restaurants in Chicago. Now, a man named Michael James Fish, who knew De Lucia in the 1920s, would confirm these facts. Capone and De Lucia, who were both of Neapolitan descent, shared several mutual friends and are alleged to have immediately hit it off. This would lead to Capone's recruitment of De Lucia into his South Side organization, and it wouldn't be long before De Lucia would allegedly quit his job at the Bella Napoli in order to officially join the Capone mob, despite still claiming to own 2 restaurants at the time as his fronts. This would have been around the time frame of 1925 or so, about the mid-1920s. Now, at this point, Ricca started to get into the gambling business by taking large bets from Al Capone himself, who would sometimes wager as high as $10,000, which would be $179,000 in today's money, on a single horse. De Lucia's original sponsor, Diamond Joe Esposito, though, would eventually fall out of favor with the Capone organization after the retirement of boss Johnny Torrio. And on March 21st, 1928, Diamond Joe would be gunned down in a drive-by shooting on the front steps of his home after returning from a political meeting. Some people have speculated that the man who set him up to be murdered was none other than Ricca, who at this time was still going by De Lucia. But on a less treacherous note, Felice De Lucia, on January 3rd, 1927, married a woman named Nancy E. Gigante, familiar name, who was born in Naples in 1905 and came to the United States in around 1930. The pair would get married at the Holy Garden Angel Church on 1717 Arlington Street in Chicago, Illinois. And who was the best man in the wedding, you might ask? Well, it's none other than Al Capone himself, indicating just how close the pair had become by that point in time. The couple would go on to have 3 children, a daughter, Mary, who was listed as Maria in his naturalization papers and Marie in the 1950 census, as well as 2 sons, Anthony and Paul. Later reports from 1958, citing the records of the Bureau of Vital Statistics, would actually find no marriage records for De Lucia and his wife between 1926 and 1929. Now, there are clearly pictures of this wedding, so it clearly happened, and I don't know why anyone would lie about such a thing. And I think what you'll find is that it's a mix-up in the paperwork related to the name that he used to get into this country. But it would be just another one of those things adding to De Lucia's air of mystery and the sense of disinformation about his early time in the United States. On September 27, 1928, at the age of 30, De Lucia became a naturalized U.S. citizen, and at that point in time, legally changed his name to Paul De Lucia, since he had been married under that name. But at a certain point, he began going by the name he would become best known as Paul Ricca. Paul Ricca joined up with the Southside Capone gang in the mid-1920s and very quickly began to rise up the ranks due to his intelligence, moxie, bravery, and overall toughness. At this point, the Capone gang was embroiled in the long and violent beer wars, with many gangs around Chicago for control of the various territories, most notably the North Side Gang, which at the time was being run by Jaime Weiss, Vincent Schemer Drucci, and George Bugs Moran. The boss of the North Side Gang, Dion O'Banion, had just been brutally executed in his flower shop on November 10th, 1924, after a double cross of Torrio and Capone. And so the North Siders wanted revenge for the murder of their leader and began to go on the offensive. In the years 1925 and 1926, it is alleged that 133 gangsters were murdered, the most violent years of the beer wars, which spanned almost the entire 1920s. An FBI report dated from 1958 would expand upon the rise of Ricca. Quote, on March 17, 1958, T2, who has furnished reliable information in the past, advised that Paul Ricca, with alias Paul De Lucia, is alleged to be a member of the Grand Council of the International Mafia Society. Ricca first gained prominence by virtue of his association with Al Capone in the late 1920s and was trusted as a killer and bodyguard for Capone. Later, he fronted for various gambling enterprises for the syndicate in Chicago, Illinois, and under the regime of Kelly Nash, political machine in Chicago, Illinois, he gained recognition as the head of the syndicate formerly led by Al Capone. End quote. That note is certainly getting a little ahead of ourselves and ahead of the story, but it does show the importance of Ricca even in those early days. And it's during the mid-1920s that Ricca's star would really begin to rise, along with that of another young up-and-comer, Anthony Tony Accardo. As legend has it, on September 20th, 1926, Capone was eating and hanging out at the restaurant attached to the Hawthorne Hotel at 4833 West 22nd Street in Cicero, Illinois, which had been the gang's headquarters. Suddenly, a caravan of 6 cars came up the street and leveled machine guns, firing over 100 rounds into the Hawthorne and the Anton Hotel, as well as other nearby buildings. Although I didn't see any articles that confirmed it, it is alleged that the first cars in the procession fired blanks, while the second group fired over 100 live rounds into the place where Capone and gang had been hanging out. Miraculously, nobody was killed, though there were 2 people wounded. Now, as the story goes, and this is beginning to dabble into the legend of the Chicago outfit, Ricca was about to enter the restaurant when he noticed several vehicles coming down the street with men he recognized to be Northsiders. Sensing the impending danger, he quickly ran into the restaurant where Capone was sitting and warned him just in time for Capone to get down, saving his life. It's also been alleged, again, a legend, that Accardo may have also jumped on top of Capone to shield him. And of course, this would build the legend of both men, and if it's true, earn the respect of Capone and many others, and was paramount to both of their rise through the organization.
On September 20th, 1926, Al Capone's biggest rivals, Irish gangsters Jaime Weiss and Bugs Moran, try to gun him down to avenge the death of Dean O'Banion.
There were over 2,000 machine gun bullets that were shot through the windows.
Now, Ricca would sustain a gunshot wound to his left shoulder, but when asked by the police for his name, he would identify himself using an alias, Louis Barco. The age of the man identified in newspapers as Louis Barco fits with the age of Ricca and the occupation, so I tend to believe this to be true. This event served to, as I just said, win the respect of Capone and his peers, which would tighten the bond of the two men and propel Ricca to the top of the organization as one of Capone's most trusted lieutenants. As I mentioned before, this could not be better evidence than Capone serving as best man in Ricca's wedding the following year. That's the ultimate sign of respect. From this point on, Ricca's prestige within the organization would only continue to rise. Ricca would be arrested in 1927 on a charge of general principles, but subsequently released. In 1929, Capone attended the Atlantic City Conference, and some sources will say that he had Ricca there as an aide, though I found really no proof that showed Ricca's attendance to be true. So I think that that one potentially could be more myth than reality. There were several members of the Chicago outfit there. Not a lot of sources name Ricca, but some sources do. Now, the infamous Atlantic City Conference in Atlantic City, New Jersey, held between May 13th through 16th, 1929, was a historic mob summit, and it was one of the first documented meetings of members of the nationwide syndicate and had a major impact on the future of the National Crime Syndicate. This, of course, was on the heels just 3 months after the St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago, which occurred, of course, on February 14th, 1929, and which, of course, had attracted a lot of unwanted media attention and drew the ire of many of the bosses around the country. It was making things incredibly hot, and they were not happy at this point in time with Capone. According to records, Capone also had other top guys. So speaking of the people that were actually documented as being there, Frank the Enforcer Nitti, Jake Greasy Thumb Gusick, and Frank Rio were allegedly in attendance. And even Johnny the Fox Torrio came out of retirement from New York to help Luciano, Costello, and Lansky facilitate and mediate the event. Now back to Ricca. He'd next be arrested in Trenton, New Jersey on June 11th, 1930, as a suspect in the murder of corrupt Chicago reporter Jake Lingle, though no disposition was shown in this arrest record. Now, this is the first time I'd actually see Ricca's picture splashed across newspapers. He was just 33 at the time of this arrest. And while I won't go too far into it, it's a pretty big rabbit hole. The Jake Lingle killing is a major story unto itself and probably deserves its own episode. On June 9th, 1930, Lingle, a reporter for the Chicago Tribune, was killed by an assassin connected to the Chicago outfit, which, as you might expect, brought down a cavalcade of heat on the members of the underworld. This murder was a huge deal in Chicago at the time, and it would eventually come out that Lingle himself, who was propped up as this righteous person after his murder, was in fact corrupt and had probably been killed as a result of his association with Chicago mobsters. He did. He was in hot water and was killed as a result. Now, Ricca, along with 5 others, including the aforementioned Jake Greasy Thumbs Gusick, would be arrested while getting off of a train on their way to see the Sharkey Schmeling fight with $60,000 in their possession to be used on bets for the fight. Now, I think one could argue, were they legitimately going to the fight, or were they getting out of Chicago, going on the lam due to the potential heat because of the Lingle situation? Now, they'd eventually be freed and not charged with any crime, but I think you can agree that it looks a little suspicious. Now, again in November of 1930, Ricca would be arrested for disorderly conduct and discharged on the same day. At this point, it's typical catch and release sorts of arrests without any major issues for young Mr. Paul the Waiter Ricca. Now, as history tells us, in 1931, Al Capone would eventually be indicted of tax evasion and would be sent off to do 11 years in the can, down in Atlanta, and then, of course, eventually in Alcatraz. He would, at this time, more or less lose control of the organization that he was most famous for and that he had in part made famous. And his position as boss, the successor, would end up being Ricca's close friend and another of Capone's top lieutenants, the aforementioned Frank the Enforcer Nitti. It's worth noting that Nitti himself was actually convicted along with Capone, but only ended up serving an 18-month sentence in Leavenworth before getting out and taking his place as boss of the Chicago family. Now, it is alleged that at this time, in the early 1930s, Nitti would appoint Paul Ricca as his number 2 or underboss, making him the second in command in the entire organization. Ricca would rise all the way from new member of the organization in the mid-1920s to underboss or second in command within the time frame of about 6 years. And if you think about it and think of all the guys who were in the outfit at that point in time, some heavy hitters, this is a meteoric and astonishing rise, if you ask me. Nitti would be laid up, speaking of going back to Nitti, he wouldn't be without his troubles. He would be laid up in 1932 after a scuffle in which he was actually shot by police. Not a lot of people know that this happened, which turns out to have potentially been an assassination attempt on the part of the police. And in the end, the police officer was actually taken to task and charged with that. He took a shot at Nitti. And it's allegedly around this time that there was a complete reorganization of the outfit. Now, of course, the interesting thing at this time going on nationwide in 1931 and 1932 is the reorganization of the National Crime Syndicate, the establishment of the commission, the 5 families, the same set of rules, the same set of structures out across the country. And a similar structure, of course, would be adopted in Chicago. However, in Chicago, there would be also another plan put into place. In a plan proposed by none other than Anthony Accardo, all mob activities within the family were departmentalized and placed in the charge of an expert hoodlum. And this, you have to hand it to him, this was an ingenious idea that Nitti and Ricca accepted and implemented, but that also helped Accardo's stature continue to grow in the eyes of our subject Ricca as not just someone who could be muscle, and he certainly was, but also someone with brains and leadership potential. So that part is important, not just Ricca being recognized for his potential, but in turn recognizing Accardo for his potential as well. And you're going to see they're going to form a very tight bond. And as you'll see, while Nitti certainly held the title as boss, Ricca would hold on to the power and the respect usually reserved for a boss. To show the national relationships that Ricca had developed by that time, he was arrested on April 19th, 1932 in a raid of the Congress Hotel. This arrest is actually extremely notable, as Ricca wasn't arrested with just anyone. Also taken into police custody with Ricca were several mobsters who I think you may have heard of: Charles Lucky Luciano, Meyer Lansky, Sylvester Agoglia, Rocco Fischetti, who gave the name John Senna, that's what you'll see in papers, and a man named Harry Brown. All the men were arrested, but subsequently freed for lack of evidence, but not before a famous police lineup photograph had been taken. Again, it shows respect that guys of the stature of Luciano and Lansky chose to meet with Ricca personally, and it's long been said that they preferred to deal with Ricca over Nitti and would go through him when the Chicago outfit came into play. An FBI note from 1958 would indicate Ricca's growing prominence at the time with well-known gangsters from the National Syndicate. Quote, "The files of T2 revealed that on various occasions the subject was associated with Lepke Buckhalter and Salvatore Lucky Luciano in various labor extortion rackets on a nationwide scale." End quote. Whether intentional or unintentional at this point, and I kind of believe it was somewhat intentional, it wasn't uncommon for Ricca to overrule Nitti's orders, which in most families would get you killed. Ricca, though, had no issue undercutting his boss, nor did he ever have an attempt on his life, which at that time happened quite often in other cities due to the various internal power struggles. Ricca, by this point, had really come into his own as a leader, and he was wielding the power and was known to be, at the same time, very soft-spoken, speaking with a soft, silent accent, though just as ruthless as any mob boss. Allegedly, when he wanted someone murdered, he would simply tell his subordinates to make him go away. Now, in addition to being soft-spoken and despite being very close friends with his fellow Neapolitan Al Capone, he did not court media attention and stayed largely in the shadows to avoid law enforcement scrutiny. Ricca's mentor, Capone, and his original sponsor into the outfit, Diamond Joe, by contrast, were flashy dressers, publicity seekers, and in the end, this led to their downfall. Ricca learned from them what not to do. He would long be noted as a conservative dresser who more closely resembled a banker than a vicious mobster and leader in the national crime syndicate. But then again, appearances can be deceiving. While Ricca certainly would be arrested from time to time, he was never convicted in all that time until you start to get into his later career. Ricca's lawyer, a man named William Scott Stewart, in 1957 would describe him as follows. Quote, T14 related that Stewart described Ricca as an example of a boy born on the wrong side of the tracks and a man who has power and money who is hard to beat. End quote. But as you got into the 1940s with Nitti, Ricca, and another up-and-comer, Tony Accardo, leading what had become known as the Chicago Outfit by that time, Ricca would face his first serious pressure from the law. Now, before we jump into the case most famously associated with Ricca, I wanted to share an anonymous letter alleged to have been sent to the famous FBI agent Melvin Purvis in 1934 regarding Mr. Ricca.
Dear Mr. Purvis, as I read in the papers, you mean business with the gangsters. I have a good job for you, for a man worse than the Linger. This man's real name is De Lucia, wanted in Naples, Italy for murder. His aliases are Paul Viela, Paul Salvi, Paul Ricca, and he is a Capone gangster. You will find this man in the Italian villaggiati the World Fair, because the village is owned by them. I am an Italian baker. This man controls the Italian baker's ass. We have to pay half cent for every pound of bread we make, and if we do not do what they say, they burn our trucks and all kinds of damages. I wish you will take care of this criminal and send him back to Italy. Hope to hear soon some good news. Very truly yours, a poor baker.
In the 1930s, Frank Nitti had hatched a scheme for the outfit to take over movie studios in Los Angeles, California. At this point in history with the mob, labor racketeering and extortion was still a relatively new way to make money. When you get control of unions, though, there are lots of ways to make money, including threatening strikes and other labor problems in return for payoffs, inflating the cost of projects and pocketing the excess money, bid rigging in exchange for kickbacks, as well as arranging no-show jobs and plenty of other ways to make money. There's probably no real limit to ways to make money, but at this point, labor racketeering was still pretty much in its infancy. Now, there are indications that in the late 1930s and early 1940s, Nitti and Ricca had already started to make inroads into labor racketeering. On June 1st, 1940, Ricca, along with several others, including Nitti, Louis Little New York Campagna, and Murray Humphreys, would have an injunction issued that forbade them from drawing from the funds or from coercing or even ousting members of a local bartenders union. An FBI report would suggest the following, quote, a Tribune clipping of June 1st, 1940 recites that a temporary injunction was granted to George McLean on a petition that hoodlums were attempting to take over the financial affairs of the Bartenders and Beverage Dispensers Union Local 278, and the following were named: Louis Romano, president of the union; James Crowley, secretary and treasurer of the union; Tom Panton, business representative of the union; Frank Nitti, Murray Humphreys, Paul Ricca, Louis Campagna, and Fred Evans. McLean claimed he was told previously by some of the gangsters, namely Nitti, Ricca, and Campagna, he had to agree to have Romano take over the presidency of the union, and because of veiled threats, he agreed to this. He claimed the persons named in the injunction wanted to take control of the union in order to loot the treasury. End quote. In October of 1940, George McLean, former president of the Chicago Bartenders Union, would tell a grand jury that he was threatened with death unless he relinquished control of the union. According to McLean, the four men who were indicted had issued death threats to McLean and his wife if they didn't step down or allow the outfit to replace McLean with Romano. McLean testified that in 1935, Nitti ordered him to put one of our men in as an officer. McLean said he told Nitti that the union board and membership would object to a non-member in an executive post. According to McLean, Nitti then said, quote, "Give us the names of any who oppose. We'll take care of them. We want no more playing around. If you don't do as we say, you'll get shot in the head. How would your wife look in black?" End quote. Now, I know this episode is about Ricca, and he was certainly brutal, but this just shows that Nitti himself was no pushover, despite how he is often portrayed. He's often portrayed as weak, and feckless, and again, this is just an example that shows he was not necessarily that. In the end, Nitti, Humphreys, Ricca, Rowland, Evans, Panton, and Campagna would be indicted for the conspiracy, and the case would go to trial. However, the jury in December of 1940 would return upon the instruction of the gangsters after McLean refused to testify any further on the grounds that he might incriminate himself, a not guilty verdict, with all being acquitted, and the gangsters would begin eyeing their next target. This time it would be the Retail Clerks International Protective Association. An FBI note would report the following, quote, a Tribune clipping on March 25th, 1943 credited the Nitti Ricca Campagna Combine with the complete cleanout of the treasury of the Retail Clerks International Protective Association Local 1248, together with Max Pollock, alias Max Caldwell, an ex-convict and ex-bootlegger. The group were alleged to have obtained about $910,000. End quote. Now that is a major score, especially for the time, and would only continue to whet their appetites. But little did anyone know, they had already turned their eyes west in the 1930s and had become fixed on the glitz and glamour of Hollywood, California. Now, prior to the outfit getting into Hollywood, Ricca had actually been the vice president and director of the World Amusement Corporation and the Playhouse Corporation, which operated the World Playhouse, a sound picture house at 410 South Michigan Avenue in Chicago that specialized in playing foreign pictures. Ricca had been associated with this business since its inception in 1933, but had no active role in its day-to-day management. In fact, Ricca would list vice president of what I believe to be the moving picture organization I just referenced, although it's a little hard to read, as his listed occupation in the 1940 federal census records. Now, interestingly enough, Ricca would also list 3 servants under his dependents, in addition to his wife and kids. Now, that's a side note. And here's another side note. In a note that is sure to make you laugh, it made me laugh when I found it. In the 1950 census, just 10 years later, Ricca would list his occupation as farming. And I'm not even kidding. That's truly what was in there. In any event, to get a foothold in Hollywood, Nitti had leveraged influential family soldier Handsome Johnny Roselli, who was a member of the Chicago outfit, who was also responsible to work with the Los Angeles crime family, and who was already out west, to gain control over the Projectors Union. Additionally, Chicago would send gangsters Willie Bioff, George Browne, as well as Nicholas Circella to assist Roselli in this plot. Now, who are these guys? George E. Browne had long had ties as a labor leader and was active as the business agent of Local Number 2 of the International Alliance of Theatrical Stage Employees in Chicago, Illinois. He had also at one point been the president of that union. Willie Bioff, or Bioff, as it's pronounced, was a Jewish mobster who'd previously been a pimp, kind of a low-level guy in Chicago, but had gotten into labor racketeering activities as early as the 1920s. He came up in Chicago under Jake Greasy Thumb Gusick prior to meeting Al Capone and Frank Nitti. Now, Bioff, who was far more rough around the edges, would serve as Browne's enforcer in their efforts to take over the unions. Nicholas Circella was also connected with the union as an international representative. Now, these 3 men had helped the outfit gain control over unions in the past, as is evidenced by the following note in an old FBI report that I found. Quote, a Tribune story of May 13th, 1948 relates to the Capone crime empire and recites that George Browne, head of the Chicago Stagehands Union and also of a Chicken Killers Union, and Willie Bioff, a panderer who had organized a protection association of Jewish butchers, joined forces. They shook down Barney Balaban of Balaban and Katz, owners of the movie chain, for $20,000, allegedly for a soup kitchen. Nick Circella, alias Dean, saw them spending wildly at his club and inquired where they got their funds. When they told of their success story, Circella ordered them to accompany him to a home in Riverside, Illinois, where they faced Frank Nitti and Frank Rio. Nitti, after hearing the tale, declared the mob in for 50%. Nitti then called a meeting at the home of Harry Hochstein in Riverside. Present were Nitti, Rio, Louis Buckhalter, Paul Ricca, Louis Campagna, and one of the Fischetti brothers, and others. It was planned to control the Stagehands Convention in 1934 in Louisville. Tony Accardo, Louis Romano, and Hindu Imburgio were in the Chicago delegation. Browne was named international president and named Bioff as his personal representative with full power to act, to call strikes, and settle them. Nick Circella was named Chicago representative. When Tommy Malloy, head of Local 10 of the Motion Picture Operators Union in Chicago, was assassinated February 4th, 1935, Nitti ordered Circella to take over the union. The Chicago Motion Picture Theater owners paid $100,000 to stop a move of the union to put 2 operators in the projection booth. Balaban and Katz paid $60,000 of the sum. Frank Meritot, alias Diamond, brother-in-law of Al Capone, was put on the payroll of the Rialto Theater at $200 a week upon orders of the mob. Phil DeAndrea was on the B&K payroll for $175 to $200 a week for 5 years. Bioff was busy shaking down Hollywood and got $100,000 from Joe Shentz, a producer. In 1935, Nitti raised the split from 50-50 to 66%. End quote. All of these stories could have been just a coincidence, but I believe it was all the buildup that made Nitti and the outfit decide on getting into Hollywood. It was just ripe for the picking, or it was all kind of happening at the same time, and it was a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy where they were seeing union infiltration and labor racketeering go well at home, and they knew, of course, that Hollywood was ripe for the picking, which it was. In short order, Browne, Bioff, Circella, and Roselli would get control of the Projectors Union, which would essentially give them a stranglehold over the movie industry in the 1930s and early 1940s, since the outfit could easily control what movies were played and which were not throughout the entire United States. Roselli, in turn, would threaten the movie studios with strikes and other labor problems in exchange for payoffs to the outfit. And he would do this through his men, Browne and Bioff. Additionally, the outfit had devised a scheme to defraud members of the unions connected to these studios by inducing them to contribute 2% of their annual salary into a fund called the 2% Assessment Fund, allegedly for the benefit of the union, but in actuality for the benefit of the outfit. In order to avoid these types of labor issues to get their movies played, major studios such as Columbia Pictures, RKO Pictures, Paramount, Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer, as well as 20th Century Fox were reputed to have paid the outfit as much as $2 million, which would be worth around $38 million in today's money, with Ricca and Campagna actually noted as receiving a larger share than Nitti himself. This was a significant, as I said, a significant untapped opportunity for the mob. And I'm honestly very surprised. It's one of the great questions in this genre, is why the Los Angeles crime family wasn't already taking advantage of the unions in Hollywood, as I'm just going to keep saying it. It was ripe for the picking. They were pretty defenseless. They couldn't stop this kind of an incursion. Now, in Hollywood, the outfit would set up shop in a place called the Gold Coast Lounge, which would be used as a gathering place for hoodlums, as well as a message center where an unlisted telephone behind the bar and a pay telephone were constantly in use for calls to Ricca, Vincent Jimmy Blue Eyes Alo, Johnny Diaguardi, as well as many others. For a while, as you'll see, the scheme was going well, it was going about as well as it could be, and was very lucrative for the outfit. However, it turns out that Bioff had let the newfound wealth go to his head and began becoming too high profile. This probably sounds familiar if you're familiar with the Chicago outfit. He was wearing fancy suits and allegedly going so far as to pass around solid gold business cards. He was making a spectacle of himself. When Bioff threatened a strike against New York movie theaters, in which he demanded, again, 2 projectionists in each theater, the owners complained that they'd go broke under the terms he was demanding. However, Bioff agreed for an arrangement for 2 projectionists in exchange for reduced pay, much of which went directly into Bioff's pockets. Now, this was literally the last straw, and by the late 1930s, newspaper campaigns, the papers would begin to get a hold of the fact that this was happening, and they would begin to bring attention to the Bioff-Browne extortion plot, which in turn would cause a huge scandal in Hollywood. At this, it's alleged that the outfit would order a hit on Willie Bioff, but that Nitti, and again, this is the speculation, it's alleged that Nitti argued for the hit to be canceled as Bioff was his guy. Now, it's odd because Nitti's the boss, right? He shouldn't have to order for a hit to be canceled, right? He should just be able to cancel it as boss. But I think you can see kind of the power dynamics that were in place even at this time, and who was really, really kind of running things. Now, This would prove to be a major mistake in retrospect, as both Willie Bioff and George Browne were arrested for extortion. Bioff would be indicted for tax evasion as well as extortion and racketeering, while Browne would be convicted as his co-conspirator. Ultimately, the scrutiny and prospect of being murdered would be too much to withstand. Rather than take their medicine and spend years in prison and keep their mouths shut, both Bioff and Browne quickly turned informants, agreeing to testify against the Chicago outfit in order to save their own skins. Both Bioff and Browne would receive significantly reduced sentences, and they would win parole in December of 1944. And remember, this is all kind of taking place in and around the 1943 timeframe, with the extortion itself taking place in the mid-30s all the way up until this point. Bioff would be reported as testifying to the following regarding the scheme. Quote, Bioff said that in the spring of 1936, a basic agreement meeting was held in New York between union leaders and film company executives. He testified that Nicholas Schenck of Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer was present and added, I told him to get together with the heads of the companies and get a couple of $1 million together. I told him this was it, Bioff testified, that if they didn't get together, we'd close every theater in the country. The sum and substance was that I made demands for a large sum of money between $2 and $3 million and said that unless the companies put up the money, the industry would have a strike on its hands. He said the 5 major companies agreed to pay $50,000 annually and that 2 minor companies agreed to pay $25,000 each. He and Browne, Bioff said, split 1/3 of the money, and 2/3 went to Paul Ricca De Lucia, one of the 8 defendants, and described by the prosecution as the leader of the Chicago ring which dominated the union. End quote. As a result of Bioff and Browne's testimony, on March 19th, 1943, Frank Nitti, Paul Ricca, Johnny Roselli, and several other wise guys, including Phil DeAndrea, Louis Little New York Campagna, Nick Cercella, Charles Cherry Nose Gio, and Ralph Pierce were indicted for extortion as well as manipulating and misusing the Teamsters Central States Pension Fund. This indictment, as you can imagine, infuriated both Ricca as well as Tony Accardo and some of the others, and they put the blame squarely on Frank Nitti for getting them into it. As a result, when the gang learned they were about to be indicted weeks, not days, before, it's alleged that Ricca, Accardo, and other outfit leaders met with Nitti at his home. Now, we know that this meeting it did take place. This meeting was reported as being surveilled by the feds in local papers. So it did happen. A lot of people believe that this is just legend. It did happen. There's a record of it, but it happened weeks before, not the day before. And the only thing about it is we know that it happened, but we can only speculate as to what was said. As legend has it, Ricca and Accardo blamed Nitti, especially since Bioff was handpicked by Nitti, and demanded that Nitti take the weight of the punishment since it was his idea. They demanded that he plead guilty to the charges in order to save Ricca and the others from going to prison. Now, here's the problem with their demand. Nitti was severely claustrophobic, allegedly from earlier stays in prison, and couldn't stand the thought of going back to prison. And so, after the indictment, March 19th, 1943, just one day before his scheduled grand jury appearance, rather than taking the brunt of the charges for the family, he found another way out, and he committed suicide. He was 56 years old and died with just $1.24 in his pocket. How the mighty have fallen. Over the years, rumors have persisted that the mob killed Nitti rather than him just simply committing suicide of his own volition. The facts, as well as just common sense, they just don't support that the mob killed Nitti, and I'll expand upon that. First and foremost, use your common sense. If the mob wanted Nitti to take the weight of the charges, they needed him alive in order to do that, correct? Hopefully you agree that makes sense. It wouldn't make sense to kill him Law enforcement wanted their pound of flesh, and the mob planned to serve up Nitti on a silver platter, if you believe that theory. That only works if Nitti is alive. He has to be alive in order to be served up, so it would make no sense to kill him. Second, the evidence at the scene of the crime just doesn't support that Nitti was killed by anybody but himself, and we'll get into that. On the morning of March 19th, 1943, Nitti had breakfast with his wife at their home on 712 Selborne Road in Riverside, Illinois. As his wife left for church, Nitti told her he planned to take a walk. Once she left, Nitti began drinking heavily in what I can only imagine was an attempt to build up the liquid courage to do what he knew he was going to do. He then loaded his .32 caliber revolver, put it in his coat pocket, and walked 5 blocks to a local railroad yard of all places. Not sure why he chose that particular place. In this particular case, there were also witnesses. And again, the facts here are going to, in my opinion, prove that Nitti killed himself. In the railroad yard that day were several men: conductor William F. Seebauer and switchman Lowell M. Barnett, as well as a man named E.H. Moran. At the time of Nitti's suicide, the men happened to be riding in the caboose of a train, backing their train slowly southward over an ungated Cermak Road in North Riverside. As Nitti walked along the track in a drunken stupor by that point, the workers spotted him and they shouted a warning. At this point, Nitti walked off the track, staggering towards the fence that was running parallel to the track. And it's at this time that the witnesses heard 3 shots ring out. The workers would later admit that they thought Nitti was shooting at them, but quickly realized he was actually trying to shoot himself in the head. According to the witnesses, Nitti's first shots actually missed. They would even say the following to papers. Quote, "Well, if he tried to kill himself, he didn't do a good job." End quote. Now, I can't imagine, and I'm trying to put myself in the mind of Nitti, and I certainly don't want to discount the idea of suicide, but to level the gun after missing those first shots took nerve. Absolutely took nerve. He was determined to do it. He was determined to take his own life. Lowell M. Barnett, one of the witnesses in the train car who were slowly approaching Nitti, would tell the following story. Quote, "Seebauer said, 'Let's rush him and take the gun away from him.' I said, 'If you think I'm going to rush a man that is drunk and with a gun, you are crazy. I've got a wife and a family.' We stopped. I stayed where I was, and Seebauer crawled through the cars to get on the side of the train away from the guy and be able to crawl up closer and look at him from under the car. Suddenly, the fellow raised himself to a sitting position, put the gun to his head, and pulled the trigger. There was a shot, and the man fell back against the fence. I said to Seebauer, 'Well, he did it this time. All you've got to do now is cut the engine off and go up and call the police.'" End quote. Dr. Samuel A. Levinson, coroner's physician, testified that 1 bullet through Nitti's right temple had caused his death. When you consider that fact, the evidence and witness statements don't support that someone else would have been firing at him unless they were literally right beside him. If someone else had been firing, the bullet is level or maybe even, going at a downward trajectory. While I know some bullets will bounce around in the skull, I think that the entry and position of the bullet would tend to indicate that he held the gun to his head, pointed up, and fired. Upon hearing the reports, Police Chief Alan Rose of North Riverside rushed to the scene with a sergeant and several beat patrolmen, and they recognized Nitti immediately. An autopsy by William McNally, coroner's toxicologist, showed that Nitti's blood alcohol level was 0.23, pretty high. A coroner's jury ruled the following day that Nitti committed suicide while temporarily insane and in a despondent frame of mind. Less than a week after Nitti's suicide, Ricca and Louis Little New York Campagna would be photographed as they surrendered together to U.S. Marshals in Chicago. Unfortunately for Ricca, on December 30th of 1943, he would be convicted along with Roselli, Francis Meritot, Phil DeAndrea, Louis Campagna, Charles Gio, and Louis Kaufman, and would be sentenced to 10 years in federal prison as well as a $10,000 fine. So again, if you're one of those that believes the outfit killed Nitti or forced his suicide, why? They needed Nitti alive to take the weight of the charges. With him dead, all of the men who were subsequently convicted became front and center. The new leaders, the new headmen, and the authorities needed to convict somebody. So it just wouldn't be sensible to willingly kill the man that you wanted to take the brunt of the prison time. And also, you got to imagine that the authorities, they were never just going to convict Nitti. It was going to be Nitti and several other people. They were never just going to convict Nitti. The death of Nitti shifted the focus to Ricca and others, and maybe they got a more severe sentence as a result, but it did shift the focus. And there's just no way, in my opinion, that Ricca would have wanted Nitti killed. Nitti was critical to Ricca and others getting a lighter sentence. It's just that Nitti had other plans. Now, it's after the Nitti suicide that Ricca is alleged to have stepped in as the heir apparent and became the official boss of the Chicago outfit, subsequently naming his friend and the other major force in his own right, Anthony Big Tuna Accardo, as his underboss. An article a few days after the death of Nitti would claim that before his death, Nitti had confided to his attorney, a man named E. Bradley Eben, that he was not the real boss of the Chicago syndicate. Here's an excerpt from that article. Quote, "A posthumous charge by Frank Nitti, mobster who committed suicide, that he was only the front man for the real gang lords of Chicago, caused a flurry of excitement in underworld circles Saturday night and made federal officials prick up their ears. The charge was spoken by E. Bradley Eben, attorney for Nitti and other Chicago hoodlums indicted at New York Friday on charges of labor racketeering. Eben was the last person known to have talked to Nitti before the gangster drank himself into a stupefaction and then shot himself through the head. Now that Frank Nitti is dead," Eben told newsmen, "I can tell you that he told me he was never the Chicago gang boss. I am not easily convinced, but I assure you that I believed him when he told me he had nothing to do with the New York extortion case." End quote. Eben said he spoke with Nitti at about 11 a.m. on the Friday of his death, and about an hour later is when Nitti committed suicide. Whether you believe this story or not, you have to admit it's interesting and shows the power of Ricca and others within the outfit. Ricca and Accardo would run the outfit together for the next 30 years, and while some call the family in Detroit the partnership, I think you can also make the argument that the ultimate partnership actually existed in Chicago between Ricca and Accardo. From everything I could tell, the pair were best friends and treated each other as such as they ran the family harmoniously over the next 30 years. As you'll see, there was no ego between the two men. They ran the family together as essentially one and sometimes shared the boss position, while at other times switching, stepping back, stepping forth, and or naming others to serve as front boss throughout the years. But to be clear, no matter who held the boss position for the next 30 years, from this case in 1943 all the way into the 70s, and even farther in Accardo's case, the power in the family was Ricca and Accardo. It should be noted that in reports after his death in 1972, Ricca would be noted as having close ties with a man named Clarence Yalis, the boss of the Moving Picture Operators Union Local 110, and would suggest that Ricca had influence over that union for many years. So despite being convicted in a highly publicized case, the Chicago outfit still found a way to sneak back in and have a major influence over Hollywood, even after his conviction, for some time afterwards. Okay, so that's the end of another episode. If you liked it, please do me a favor and share the episode. If you haven't yet subscribed, I encourage you to hop on board and subscribe via YouTube or consider signing up as a capo on my Patreon channel. In any event, please leave your comments below to tell me what you liked and disliked, and if you want to reach out to me personally, you can send me an email at ganglandhistorypodcast@gmail.com. I appreciate all of you and look forward to continuing to produce plenty of new content. I've got big plans. In the near future, we'll be dropping part 2 of the State of the Mafia 1967 series. Part 2 of the Paul the Waiter Ricca episodes is going to be coming shortly after that. An episode on Robert Bobby Simone, recorded with friend of the show Tony Toke, and doing a scene breakdown of The Godfather that will exist only over on Patreon. In any event, thank you for your continued support. And as I end every episode, grazie.
Thank you for listening to the Gangland History Podcast. If you'd like to donate to the show, check out our Patreon channel. If you're watching on YouTube, please hit like and subscribe to help the channel grow. If you're an audio-only listener, subscribe via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, or anywhere you get your podcasts. Until next time, don't forget to keep your mouth shut.